Now broadcasting. I'll let all of our attendees in the webinar. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris. I'm the events coordinator. And tonight, we're very happy to be hosting the launch for How We Live Now by Bill Hayes. We'll be in conversation with Roz Chast. You can buy the book at powerhousebookstores.com. The link is in the event page, and it is also posted in the chat. I will send out book plates. Is that true?
Yep.
Signed book plates for any book bought with us. And if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And Bill will take your questions at the end of the event. And let me introduce Roz and Bill now. Roz Chast grew up in Brooklyn. Her cartoons began appearing in The New Yorker in 1978, where she has since published more than 1,000. She wrote and illustrated the #1 New York Times bestseller, Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? A National Book Critics Circle Award and Kirkus Prize winner, and finalist for the National Book Award. What I Hate from A to Z, and her cartoon collections The Party, After You Left, and Theories of Everything. Bill Hayes is the author of Insomniac City and The Anatomist, among other books, and a forthcoming History of Exercise, Sweat, to be published by Bloomsbury. Hayes is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in Nonfiction and is a frequent contributor to the New York Times. A collection of his street photography, How New York Breaks Your Heart, was published recently by Bloomsbury. He has completed the screenplay for a film adaptation of Insomniac City, and he is also a co-editor of Oliver Sacks's posthumous books. He lives in New York. I'll hand it over. Thank you.
Hi, Billy.
Hey, Roz. Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see you, Billy. And I'm very excited about this. And we're here to talk about your upcoming book,
Yes.
How We Live Now. And we certainly do. And I guess I want to start by asking you, when did you first realize that this wasn't just like another news story about some virus, but it was actually something that was going to change the way we all live?
I think probably towards the very end of February, beginning of March, as I read about it in Asia and Europe, and just felt like it was almost like a tsunami approaching our shores. And sure enough, by the first week of March, it had hit the US.
I'm actually surprised in a way, because it's actually kind of great, because I think for me, I was very naive. There were so many stories that I hear all, on the news about a virus here, a disease here, and I don't know, like that mosquito thing. And I just never really thought, I never took it that seriously. I never thought there was going to be Lord knows why. I was so, blasé about it. But I never thought there'd be an Ebola outbreak in the United States. I never gave much thought to the mosquito, West Nile virus, any of that.
Right.
So I was much later to realizing the seriousness of it, and that it was here.
Yeah. Well, how could one ever have imagined what this would become? I mean, yes, I sort of felt like it was coming and it was going to be serious. And perhaps because I lived through the AIDS pandemic in the 1980s. I lived in San Francisco. I moved there in 1985 and experienced that entire pandemic, which of course has been devastating and continues to this day. There still is not an AIDS vaccine. And 32 million people around the world have died of AIDS since the beginning of that pandemic. And I think I remember how in the very early days, it spread via just basic air travel, international air travel. And, but of course, I could never have imagined it would become the global pandemic it has become, and that we would be on lockdown and stay at home, and that our lives would change virtually overnight.
Right.
Yeah.
And the thing with AIDS, I think you and I have talked about this a little bit, is that uh, they figured out how, more or less, how it was spread. Not at the beginning, because at the beginning there was so much paranoia, like, could you get it from sharing food with somebody? But here, I mean, we still don't even really know with this. We know it's breath, it's respiratory, but, do you remember at the beginning when they talked about like washing down groceries and stuff?
Yeah. It's amazing how much has happened in the past 6 months, isn't it?
Yes. And also how little.
And also how little. True. Yeah.
I mean, it's just a very, I think we're all sort of feeling that. I remember something that one of my kids said in May. He said, and talking about just how sort of shrunken our lives have all become. Like, we don't travel, we
Right.
eat out the way we used to, as blithely. We don't go into stores. We, going, and this was back a couple of months, and it was like going to the grocery store. It was like, do I really need that? Or maybe I won't go to the grocery. Nervous. And he said, it's like we all got old at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's really a good way to put it.
Yeah.
I think, in some ways, I think that's what I tried to capture in this book, how our lives changed virtually overnight in ways we could never have imagined.
Yes.
And for me to try to capture in real time what it has been like.
No, I wanted to ask
you. Changes.
You keep a journal, right?
I do, at the behest of my late partner, Oliver Sacks, God bless him, who really, when I first met him in person, I wasn't really writing much in those days. And he said, when I moved to New York, he said, you must keep a journal. And I followed his advice and started a journal in 2009. And I still keep it, maybe not as closely as, or, it's gone through stages, but I did keep a very close journal during the pandemic. And a lot of the material from this book came directly from those journals.
Are you still keeping it?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Still making notes. And that's really how this book started, just with notes from a journal, things I was noticing, things I was hearing or not hearing, how our lives were changing so quickly.
At what point did you realize that this might actually become a book?
Well, I have to give credit to my editor, Nancy Miller at Bloomsbury, who's also your editor and our friend. So we share an amazing, brilliant editor, Nancy Miller.
Yeah.
Believe me, I had no idea that I would write a book about the pandemic in 2020. And in fact, at the end of January, I completed a draft of a different book, a very different book on the history of exercise called Sweat, which I'd been working on for years. And I sent that in to Nancy at the end of January. I also finished this screenplay for Insomniac City. So I thought I was just gonna sort of sit back for a few months and relax, and that this would be the year of my book on the history of exercise. But not long into the pandemic, after it hit the US, maybe the second week of March or so, I was posting some things on Facebook, little vignettes about things I was seeing in my neighborhood or at my bookstore. And as you know, I'm a street photographer, so posting photos. And Nancy arranged for a FaceTime meeting. And I thought it was going to be a meeting about talking about this other book, Sweat. And instead she said, what would you think about writing a short book and photographing a short book about the pandemic? And I was sort of taken aback, but I immediately said, yeah, that is a great idea. And in retrospect, it just feels like a great gift. It was a gift to have this book to work on. And especially in those early days when we were really on lockdown and I live alone, and it kept me from climbing the walls. And I wrote and photographed the book in 2 months.
Wow. That's fast for a book. I mean,
Yeah.
I know you, and I do books also, and that is fast, and it's a wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful book. I love especially the way it combines pictures and words, and that to me is one of the reasons why I love cartoons and why I love graphic novels, and also why I love this book so much, because there is this wonderful uh, it's not just images. There's like a story. There's
Right.
a whole story through. It's not just separate images and then descriptions of what you're seeing. It's the
Mhm.
images play alongside of this narrative that's, very moving in a way. I mean, can you talk a little bit about looking out your window?
Sure. I mean, the cover of the book shows 8th Avenue, which is right out there. I would turn the computer monitor if I could. Completely empty. I think I took the photo April 1st. Now, this is a very, very spooky and unusual sight because what I was used to was seeing 8th Avenue just clogged with traffic. And in fact, I found it very beautiful. I would look out at, let's say, 6 o'clock and see 8th Avenue, just a sea of red lights, of brake lights and traffic lights, just clogged from here to Central Park. And in fact, the first photograph, or one of the first photographs in the book, is of 8th Avenue in December, just December 2019. And a few pages later, it's followed by 8th Avenue completely empty. And throughout the book, there's this sort of before and after, both
Yeah.
photos and in stories. New York before the pandemic and after. And so those two photos side by side really tell that story. And as you said, I think photos can tell stories as well as prose.
Yours absolutely do. I mean, I think that's why, for me, they appeal so much, because they're they do tell stories. All of your photos tell stories. And a lot of them tell stories of another thing that you and I have in common, which is our love of this amazing city. I mean, New York, there are people who I think are more, they move around and they love the place that they're in, but they don't they don't have that extreme love for a place. And for me, New York is a sort of magical place. I know I moved out of the city when I had my second kid, and we raised our family out, blah, public schools and blah, and smaller class size, the usual, and also lack of, the funds to bring up two kids in the city. But every time I came into the city, every time I got into Grand Central, it was just like, oh, thank God, I can take off this hat. I can take off this little suburban hat and just be myself. And I mean, it's so, yeah. I mean, and you were there throughout this whole thing. I mean, another thing people talk about a lot, and I think you've mentioned in your book, was the sound, how quiet it
Yeah.
was in March and April.
Yeah, I mean, I just talked about seeing 8th Avenue completely emptied out at rush hour, what would normally be rush hour. But just as eerie, but in a certain way kind of beautiful, was how quiet it became. So quiet, I could hear birds singing instead of traffic and horns honking and people. I could hear birds singing. I could hear a single voice on the street. I could hear someone at the gas station kitty corner from me talking on a cell phone. So that was extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's been a tragic and frightening time, but there have been moments of real beauty and grace, and that is also what I've tried to capture in the book.
You did. I mean, there's a real elegiac kind of,
Yeah.
quality. It's seeing those pictures of the city empty. I mean, that was seeing the city from outside those first couple of months when I didn't come in at all. It was really very scary looking. And your photos also of the subway.
Yeah.
I mean, you take the subway at all, or when did you take it, and what was that like?
I remember so clearly the last time I took the subway before the lockdown, which was March 13th. It was a Friday, and I had to go pick up some prints. I have my photos printed at a fine art printer in Long Island City, and it's a really nice, easy subway ride on the E train.
Yeah.
But by that time, things were getting spooky, and I thought about taking a taxi or an Uber, and then I thought, but it's such a quick subway ride.
Yeah.
But the mood inside the car was unlike any I'd ever experienced. There was just this tension. And keep in mind, this was before people were wearing masks. But there was a sense that, everyone wanted to keep away from one another. And I remember feeling glad when I got back home.
Yeah.
And then I didn't take the subway again until, maybe late June or something.
Yeah.
So it was a while, but I did go down into subway stations and into trains just to take photos. And that was probably one of the spookiest things I'd ever done, because I went deliberately at rush hour when the subway stations would normally be so packed and trains would be so packed.
Yeah.
And they were just empty.
That's so scary. Those were the images that got me so much when I would be watching, on TV or whatever, pictures of the city in March and April, especially in April. And, it would be like, well, this is the train, at rush hour. And there'd be like nobody on it. It would be really creepy.
Yeah. In fact, do you want to look at some photos?
Yeah, I would love to.
Okay, I'm going to play a little slideshow.
Cool.
It's really quick. Bear with me. There we go.
Yeah. Yeah, those before and after pictures of 8th Avenue. That's amazing.
Yeah. And there was one subway shot there. In the book itself, there's a shot where I went into an L train. And as you know, the L train, especially at rush hour, can be so packed. It goes from here to Brooklyn and back.
Yeah.
And I think there might have been 3 people in the entire line of a train that was idling. So I went in, I took a bunch of pictures really fast. I didn't really want to go on the ride, and ducked back out. But I did it, I did subway photos over a couple of weekends and weeks, and then just picked the very best ones for the book.
Well, they're wonderful. It's funny. I think the subway is probably pretty safe.
Yeah.
Right now.
And we talked about that the other night. We had, you and I had dinner on the Upper West Side, which, as we said, is dinner outdoors and distanced. And it's one of the very few upsides to this whole pandemic is this outdoor dining during the summer.
Yeah.
But we both talked about how the subway feels very safe. I mean, I've been riding it recently, and everyone is masked and socially distanced, and the cities have never been cleaner.
Yeah, I do feel that the subway is not where I'm going to get sick.
Right.
What I wonder about, what I've heard from people is that Midtown is still pretty empty because people haven't gone back to work.
Right.
Do you have any feelings about, or any intuition about how this will play out? Do you think that people will come back to offices, or
It's hard to know, and things have changed so quickly. I think that question really depends upon, in some ways, depends upon treatment and a vaccine.
yeah,
And yet, at the same time, it has been amazing to see how New Yorkers have adapted very quickly to this new normal, whether at a bookstore or a restaurant or a shop.
Have you seen any things during this that have just sort of inexplicably made you just weepy?
Sure. I mean, one thought that just comes to mind is, there was that moment. In fact, I write about it in the book when there was a headline in the New York Times that said something like, "Now is the time to make your own face mask." Because before that, authorities were sort of hedging and saying, no, only for frontline workers, don't hoard them, you don't need to wear a face mask. Right. And then suddenly they were saying, wear a face mask, and there were all these videos about how to make face masks. And I couldn't find a bandana or a scarf or something like that. So I improvised, and first I tried a vacuum cleaner bag, which I cut up.
Used, I hope.
And clean, a new one. But it was so thick, I couldn't breathe. And then I found this in a drawer this morning. This is like going into my time capsule. So I made a face mask out of a cloth napkin with shoelaces.
That has a lot of connotations to me.
Like what?
Okay. When I see that, I think of pioneer women and sanitary napkins. I mean, it's just not good. It's just not good at all.
That might have worked better than a cloth napkin.
Yeah.
But you asked about a touching moment. So, and I also try to make it
like a weird, it touching, or it can be something that just inexplicably reached you. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you what happened to me, which in March, it must have been about this third week in March, and I was already feeling very fragile about all of this. And I started thinking about, this is going to sound insane, it's not Papaya King, not Mr. Papaya, one of those it's a Papaya King-like place on the corner of 72nd, Gray's Papaya, that's it, Gray's Papaya on 72nd and Broadway.
Yeah.
Where probably once a year I buy a hot dog there, if that. It's not like I always go to Gray's Papaya. No, it's just, but it has always been there.
The New York institution.
It's a New York institution. It was there in 1978 when I moved into my apartment. When I moved back part-time to the city, back to the Upper West Side, it was still there. It just made me happy for some reason to see it. And I started to sort of imagine that it was going to go out of business, and I got hysterical weeping. Thousands of people dying from coronavirus? No. Gray's Papaya disappearing? That's what made me cry. I mean, it's just, and it was hysterical crying. I think it was for me, it sort of symbolized what New York was going to lose, right, and what would not come back. And I'm happy to say that Gray's Papaya is doing very well. So check that one. I know. I mean, I'm telling you, who knows? It's check that worry off my list. But.
Right. Well, I think that's something I also tried to capture in the book, this sort of before and after, and what we have lost, probably. In some cases that we've probably lost. Hopefully aspects of New York will come back, but as you read the book, there are recollections about subway rides or experiences in crowded bars or in restaurants, or a taxi ride,
Yeah, just
sort of contrasting the before and after.
All the things that we did without really thinking about. Right. And it does seem do you think of it as the before times, kind of like before Corona, BC? I mean,
I think so. I mean, I do think New York will come back. I mean, there's no place like New York and New Yorkers, uh,
yes.
for sure. But and it will be a different city, but it will come back in a different way, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I worry about some places that seem, I mean, and it's one of the things that I loved so much about New York, which was going down some weird side street in Midtown and running into some shoe store that made orthopedic shoes, and like everything in the window was covered with dust, but they still were operational, and they had those weird like polio shoes and stuff with it. And I wonder, like, how is that store going to come back?
Yeah.
You know, it won't. And one of the things that made New York and makes New York so special is this sort of layering of eras. You know, you have this, you know, super deluxe condo, or a very fresh faced store, you know, for some kind of cosmetic you've never heard of, next to the orthopedic shoe store that's been there since, you know, I don't know what, the pre-Cambrian era or something, you know, and it's all mashed together, and all different eras, and, you know, store that just sells like doilies from the 1950s, doily supplies, you know, whatever. Anyway, I think it is almost time to take some Q&A if
Really?
we
My
want to feel
goodness.
like. Okay. Carl D'Aquino asks, what would a typical journal entry be?
For me, a typical journal entry might be, well, a couple things. It might be a story of an encounter I had on the street. In fact, there are a lot of those in the book. Um, you know, it's part of my practice just to, even before the pandemic, just to go for a walk, open myself up to chance, really.
Mhm.
All the green lights, like with no destination in mind, just if the light is green, I'll go that way. No
Yeah.
change, I go that way with my camera, and see what happens and see who I meet. And so in the course of working on this book, for example, one day meeting three very young doctors from NYU who were sitting on a stoop. This was early in the pandemic, having dinner and drinks on their stoop. And it was at a moment where no one else was doing something like that. So of course I had to stop and say, hey guys, and can I take your photo? And they said, sure. And we started talking. And it turned out that all three of them had COVID-19, had coronavirus early in the pandemic, like in January, and recovered quickly, and told me that almost everyone in their department at NYU had gotten sick, that it had just blown through their department. And they didn't know at that time that it was COVID-19. They just thought it was a terrible flu.
Wow.
So it's the first time I'd heard it. It was really good to hear a story about people who had recovered, because I was only hearing about deaths.
Yeah.
And their experience of it, you know, what it was like. So I came home and then I wrote down that story of that encounter, including the dialogue I had with these young men. And I had taken a photo of them as well. Other times, a journal entry might be just some internal thought I have sitting here in this apartment. You know, I remember lying on the couch one day and just realizing how very, very, very quiet it was, and that I could hear a bird singing. And that just struck me. And I usually, my journal entries start with a you know, jotting on a notepad, and then I go into a computer version of it. And this New York journal, which I started in 2009, must be something like, I don't know, like 1,500 pages at this point. So when it came to writing this book, especially drawing on stories from before the pandemic, there were stories and thoughts and images to draw from. And these were all, of course, post-Insomniac City. In some ways, this new book is almost like a little sequel to Insomniac City. And together with my book of photography, How New York Breaks Your Heart, the three make a kind of trilogy about my life in New York.
Yeah. Well, I mean, New York has such a sort of, the street life is like nowhere else in the world. You, in your book, you also, and this is from before the pandemic, you talk, there's a conversation you have with two young people where you're just waiting for the light to change, and they're talking about an apartment house.
Yeah.
And then, like, and it's like this really cool looking building, and you say, they're talking about like wanting to live there. And then the three of you have, I mean, could you describe it? Because it's such a charming, funny conversation.
It was just the kind of thing that happened all the time, and that happened all the time to me, just falling into a conversation with complete strangers, even just as you cross the street, and your encounter with them maybe no more than 1 minute or 30 seconds. And you can connect with people, or you could,
Yeah.
you know, and that has changed with the pandemic. So in the book, that story of meeting that young couple and having this sort of charming fantasy about living in this beautiful brownstone is followed by a much more stark and austere story about my walking around the empty streets and finding them just empty, and feeling a little spooked by it. But then this sort of gets back to what you asked me about, a touching moment. This was when I was wearing my cloth or underwear masks. I couldn't find
Pioneer science, pioneer mask.
I couldn't find a mask to buy, and I happened to come across an independent pharmacy, a little pharmacy on 14th Street. There's no one on 14th Street, which is usually so busy. And there was a big sign in the window that said something like 2 free disposable masks for anyone. Just knock on the door, ring the bell. And I rang the bell, and this pharmacist came to the door, and I said, "May I have a mask?" You know? And he said, "Yes, just one moment." And he went back, and he came back, and he gave me 2 kind of surgical masks in a sanitary bag. And it was like this little gift. You know, nothing was required. I didn't have to buy anything at the pharmacy. He was just being a kind fellow New Yorker. And that really choked me up.
Yeah, that I think that would choke me up. Shona Grant asks, Shona Grant asks, what do you think Oliver would have made of this era in this changed world?
Yeah, get asked that a lot. And you know, I'm now living in what was Oliver Sacks's apartment. This is Oliver's 130-year-old grand piano behind me. Oliver, if he were alive, would be 87 today. He saw a lot in his life, including treating survivors of the encephalitis lethargica pandemic of the early 20th century, what came to be known as his awakenings patients.
Right.
So I think, you know, he would have drawn some parallels with other terrible pandemics in history. I think he would have, I think Oliver would have been absolutely horrified by President Trump and his administration and the handling of this pandemic.
Yeah.
I think he would have had fear as an elderly person about getting sick.
Yeah.
He would have worried about the many complications and unusual symptoms. He certainly saw that with his encephalitis lethargica patients. We're seeing that somewhat with coronavirus, that it can manifest in many different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think about it a lot, especially living here and writing my book at the desk where Oliver wrote so many of his books.
Well, this is a good question, and it's what we've been talking about a lot, from Raul Rodriguez. Raul and John here, what do you both think makes New York so strong, even in the face of a pandemic?
You go first.
Okay. All right. I think that New Yorkers have a reputation, a bad reputation in a lot of parts of the country for being mean or cold.
Right.
I don't think that's it at all. I think, yeah, you know, New Yorkers can be brusque, but I think partly it's because, especially in Manhattan, it's so compressed, you know, it's so densely populated that there's a little bit of a sense like, well, back in the past when the subway was so crowded, it's not like, oh, it's just like a dystopian future where everybody's like living in their own world and, you know, on their phone. No, it's that it's just so freaking crowded every freaking second that like you give people the gift of letting them alone in their own world to have their own quiet thought.
Right.
And there's a sort of respect and an understanding that you might not want to be barged in on every second because you're constantly, there's everything at you every second. But I think in a crisis, we know that we're too dependent on one another to pretend that we're all living a million miles from each other and everybody, you know, we're all out for themselves. We all live together or we die together. You
Right.
know, we're all interconnected and interdependent. And I think we know that on a non-intellectual level. We know that on a really basic, every emotional, intellectual, physical level, you know. And so I think there's a way that New Yorkers feel very connected and loving of each other, even if it's not shown in the same way that it may be shown in other parts of the country. I don't know.
Yeah.
Your turn.
Oh, I would say almost exactly the same thing. I mean, I think the fact that it is so densely populated in a relatively small geographic area, we sort of have to look out for one another. And I think it's one reason New York has ultimately done so well in this pandemic. You know,
You've done amazingly well.
amazing. I mean, back in April, as I write in the book, and the book is really written in real time. So basically starts in mid-March and goes to mid-May, so about 2 months. And then I wrote a postscript, which deals with the Black Lives Matter marches and demonstrations following the murder of George Floyd in the first week of June. So it was a brief postscript. And so the book sort of spans the first 100 days of the pandemic. But yeah, I'm with you. There's a way in which New Yorkers, as brusque as they might be, look out for one another.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when we had dinner last week, that was my second trip to the city since this started. And I was almost moved to tears several times at how ingenious and how hard everybody was working to make things okay. You know,
Right.
like those enclosures in the street for the restaurant tables. I mean, that's not easy to do. And I had, the night before, I had dinner with somebody else, and the place had strung these little lights on the enclosure. I mean, and it was beautiful. It went on at 8 o'clock and in the dusk, and that almost made me cry. I mean, that was like, people are really working hard, you know, to survive, to make it okay. And yeah, there's not really tourists here now, which is, you know, not something I feel that I have mixed feelings about that, let's say. I don't want to sound like a mean person. But you know, and especially because the, you know, the theater district and stuff. But yeah, that's pretty empty because if there's no theater.
Right.
But oh, hold on one second. Let me just turn this off just a second.
Sure. And I'll have a drink. Cheers, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this book launch.
Sorry, I had to. My husband put the fan on thinking that it was like a good thing, but it's so noisy. It just sounds like a jet engine. And it was like, nope, nope, nope.
I really thought you were going to go get one of your birds.
Oh, no. They're like busy doing bird things.
Okay.
Let's see.
Another question.
Okay, yes. Nancy Cossette says, what is your favorite photo in the book and why? And before you answer that, I do have a question for you about the photos. You told me that you took something like 900 photos, or
Way more
about
than that, actually.
more than that? I mean, for How did you winnow them down? And because there's like about 35 in the book?
There are 35 photos in the book. Um, I think during that period, let's say beginning of March through 1st of June, I mean, I don't really know, but I would say I took at least a couple thousand photos. Now, I take a lot of photos because one has to take a lot of photos in order to get good ones. And I may come home and have taken 100 photos, let's say. Maybe I made trips to a couple subway stations and I shot some people on the street and took photos of buildings and all kinds of things. And then I sit down at my computer and I only edit the ones that I feel are going to be good photos. Yeah. Whatever that means. Good compositionally, good graphically, good emotionally. So the number is very large. And then, you know, the group that I chose from was maybe more like 500 or so. Okay. And it was a very intuitive process, you know, which photos to select.
They're
and where would they fall in the book. And
they seem very emblematic and really, really good. I mean, they say a lot. All the books say a lot. And I like that they're all different. You know, they're not, there's people, there's personal ones, there's the ones at the subway, but they still very much seem like your photos.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, you know, I've been asked several times, like, how did you do this? How did you write and photograph this book in 2 months?
Tell us that.
Well, I guess I would say that all of my work to date, or my career to date, sort of prepared me for this moment, because I had been shooting photographs on the street since moving to New York in 2009, so for 11 years. And taught myself how to use a camera, taught myself how to do street photography, made tons of mistakes, learned from my mistakes, was comfortable approaching strangers to ask them if I could take photos. So that when this moment came and I was going out, usually in the afternoon, to take photos, it was not a new skill, and I think I could do it efficiently and quickly. And you know, some very, very basic lessons that I learned early on, like always have your camera on and the lens cap off, because if you don't, you might lose a really good picture. Yeah. I guess the question was, what's one of your favorite pictures? Yeah. One that just came to mind is, I think it's called A Kiss at the Farmer's Market. And I was at the farmer's market at Union Square, wandering around, just kind of looking for photos and not really finding things. And then I happened to catch this couple who'd been working at the market. And it was the end of the day, they were packing up their truck, and they had a kiss. They were kissing. And I happened to be standing there just as they were kissing and hugging. And I caught the picture because I just happened to be there with my camera on and the lens cap off. And it captures a really intimate, sweet moment. And then I chatted with them and I said, is it okay? And I took your picture and I showed it to them on my camera, and I still remember their names. It was Daria and Jacob. So Daria and Jacob, if you're out there, thank you for that photo.
Look, Jane Breyer says, your photos show an incredible ability to connect with the subject. How has that changed, if at all, during the pandemic?
I think a lot. I mean, it was kind of, it was very striking at first going out when things were very scary, and just seeing the fear in people's faces. I mean, it was fear about what was happening. Yeah. So that if I approached, you know, the immediate reaction was to be afraid. Yeah. So just having to be really chill and tell them what I'm doing, and explain that you know, in those days I was just like, sort of trying to capture what's happening in our city. And usually people were really cool. But one thing I want to say about the photographs, you know, as I said, I probably took a couple thousand during that period. But in those early days, you remember it was only social distancing that we were practicing for a few weeks there. There were no masks or really obvious signs of what was happening. So although I got some really good portraits and great pictures, and I was always at least 6 feet away, which is what was recommended. When I look at them now, they don't necessarily convey that we're in the middle of a pandemic. So I had to look for pictures that conveyed something about the situation we were in. And I mean, a good example, there's a photo early in the book of a woman sitting alone on a park bench.
Yes, yes, it's from March.
Right, from March. And she's very clearly alone because the rest of the park bench on both sides of her are completely empty.
Yeah.
So it really conveyed that sense of social distancing, especially if you compare it to other photographs I've taken of people on park benches. I could probably do an entire book of people on park benches where they're crowded with hilarious juxtapositions of New Yorkers.
This is a very good question, because I always wonder when you know, talking about like street photography. I mean, well, I'll ask this question first, and then I want to ask a question. For
I'm listening that again. Turn on the light. All right, go ahead.
Okay, Janice Radomski is asking, do you always ask your subjects permission before taking the photo? And then doesn't that ruin the spontaneity of the moment? And that's very related to what I was going to ask you. Like, how does that work with, you know, what your street photography is very different from certain kinds of street photography from the 60s. Right. I think, I don't know, Diane Arbus or Robert Frank, or, I don't know, I'm blanking out the names of some people who just took photos of people without asking permission. Right. Your photos, so could you talk about that a little bit?
Or like Gary Winogrand, who was
that's
walking down the streets of New York just taking hundreds of photos.
Yeah.
You know, I've just never been comfortable with that. I just never been comfortable with that. So from the very beginning, even in 2009 when I first started out, I would approach people and ask, may I take your picture? That's always been my practice. And yes, to answer her question, it does you do sometimes lose the spontaneity, or you lose a picture, but it's worth it, I think. And you know, I call my pictures of people on the street portraits, because they really are almost like on the spot portraits of people. What's perhaps different about photos in this book is that there are fewer portraits of people and more of empty streets, empty subway stations, empty cars. And those are contrasted with photos which are included in the book from before the pandemic.
Yeah.
I very carefully, with our great editor, Nancy Miller, selected a few photos from before the pandemic, most of them taken last summer, to give a sense, a contrast of how much things have changed so quickly. So there's a photo I love, for example, from the Gay Pride Parade in 2019, of this group of kids on a stoop here in the West Village, clearly having a great time, just crowded onto a stoop. And it's a very joyful picture. And it's exactly the kind of picture I could never capture this summer.
Yeah, well, hopefully next summer.
Yeah.
Yeah, because this has been a strange, I mean, we're doing the best we can, you know? I feel like that's what this is sort of, for everybody, you know? It's very much, there's a little bit of a Groundhog Day feel, but also we're doing the best we can and having as much empathy for one another as possible, because everybody is pretty much going through it, at least in New York, in a sort of similar way. I mean, nobody is going to the theater or, you know, the gym or which doesn't bother me, but might bother other people. You know, nobody's. It's sort of the same. We're all wearing masks, hopefully. You know, which is a strange kind of thing. I mean, sometimes do you ever like you're out and like everybody's wearing a mask and you just think, if this were last year at this time, I would just think I was having some sort of really weird, bad drug experience. Like this would just not make any sense at all.
Yeah.
Anything that I'm looking at, the buses where you get on in the back and the empty subway cars at rush hour and everybody, you know, with their mask and none of it would make any sense.
No. And I have to say, as a photographer who loves to photograph people, it's been hard and kind of sad because I love to photograph faces, and the masks cover up faces and smiles and expressions. But you know, I felt like a certain responsibility with this book to document what life is like now, how we live now. And so there's a kind of progression in the photographs. We talked about the photograph of the woman alone on a park bench during the social distancing days, but by the end of the book, people are wearing masks.
Yeah, but it's gotten, I mean, when I looked at that picture of the woman alone on the bench in March, and I think about what things were like where I am in March, and then I contrast that to now, it's not better. I mean, partly it's the weather, you know, that once it got warmer, it seemed like it was just easier to be outside. And I mean, the park, I was there a few days ago and it was great. You know, I never felt like, oh my God, there's too many people. You know, I've heard that from a couple of people. I never felt that. I felt like it was very easy to maintain social distance, and plus you're outside, and it was just great to see so many people outside. I mean, so much better than it was in March where you didn't leave your house, you know.
Plus, you know, and I live in one of the least affected neighborhoods in New York. Even in the West Village, there were big refrigerated morgue trucks for the dead bodies.
That's just so horrible.
At a time when there were 800 to 1,000 people a day dying. So that has changed. Listen, let me throw a question back to you, Roz.
Okay.
I want to ask, I feel like you in your own way have been documenting the pandemic through your cartoons for The New Yorker.
Yes. I mean, that is my job in a certain way. I'm trying to get gotten darker, and I'm just going to see if I can get a little more light here. Bang. That was my ukulele.
Do you want to play?
That's kind of my job in a way, and it's also what I like to do. Is I think for me the cartoons are in a way to process whatever I'm going through, and certainly the experience of going through this pandemic affects me in every way every day, you know, from the beginning of you know, just the kind of panic and of staying inside, really just not wanting to go to the store, to a few weeks ago I had a cartoon about it was called Refresher Course, and it was about going to what is store, you know, STOR, and store buy things with Moni. What Moni? And then, you know, just explaining what, and the store, of course, it sells like mini doodad. And, you know, because it's not like the grocery store or like, you know, essential store, like a store where you'd buy like a candle or.
Right. I don't know. Well, you talk about one of my favorite cartoons is Dr. Fauci on your shoulder.
Oh, Fauci on your shoulder. Yes. Yeah. You're not 6 feet. That's 4.5 feet. But, you know, look more at the questions here. Okay. Shonagram says, not really a question, but a thought from the other side of the world. Some of us wonder whether we will ever get to New York City again. Your books are one way we can be there. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful to hear.
Yes.
Hi, Shona. Hi, Australia. Wonderful to have everyone here. Thank you all for being with us. This is amazing.
It is.
Yeah, I hope that my book does give you a glimpse of what it's been like, and also a little bit of light and hope too. It's also a very romantic book because I'm a total romantic, whether about New York or others.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm romantic about New York. I don't know if I'm really a romantic.
I think that's how we bonded.
Yes, it's true. It's true.
And when
Maybe.
we met, I had just finished writing Insomniac City. I just finished, and you were at some stage, maybe in the middle of writing your book, going into town about New York. So we,
Right. Yes. And I would feel remiss if I didn't mention E.B. White's book about New York called Here is New York, which is
yeah,
one of the best books ever written about the city. And he talks about how New York bestows the gift of loneliness for those who desire such queer prizes. And he doesn't say solitude. He doesn't say aloneness. He uses loneliness. And that's always stuck with me. And I don't know, it's just a really excellent book about New York and what it's like and the city that you and I have
yeah,
bonded over and we love so much and want to see do well and survive and come back
yeah.
in whatever form it comes back, you know? I mean, we just have to.
I love your image of almost like an archaeological dig,
It
because
is.
I think this is a whole new layer that we are in, and there will be a new New York, and it will be different, and
Yeah.
there will be elements of the New York we've each fell in love with,
Yeah.
but it will be a new city.
It will be a new city.
Yeah. Are there more questions? I think we're coming around toward the end.
I think we are. Oh, is there's one more here? Wait a second. Wait a second. Nope, that was the. Oh, okay. Here's one. You mentioned your book from William Goldstein. Oh, possibly Bill Goldstein. You mentioned your book Insomniac City, and you also wrote a book called Sleep Demons.
Yes.
How have you been sleeping in the pandemic? Any good pandemic dreams?
I did have a dream once, like an anxiety dream about not having a mask. Yeah.
And many people I know have had that too. Or you have a mask, but you're in this crowded place and nobody else does.
Yeah.
Eerie.
Eerie. Yeah. I think I've been sleeping about the same. I think I'm a born insomniac and always will be. But I think because of the quiet and just the change of the pace of my life, you know, I'm not going out to the gym. I'm not going out to dinner really or lunch with my agent or friends. I'm spending a lot of time here. And certainly working on this book, I was immersed in working on this book day and night for about 100 days. So I did learn a little bit how to nap during the day, which is a new skill for me.
Projects are wonderful. And this is a wonderful book, wonderful project. I'm glad that you did this. I'm glad it's a wonderful book for you, but it's also a document of this time, and it's such a good one. So I think it is now 8:00, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Roz. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone who asked questions. And if you missed any of the event, we'll have it on YouTube. And of course, buy the book. We have the links on the event page. And thank everybody for tuning in.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, Billy. I love you.
Chris, love you, Roz. Thank you, Powerhouse, for hosting.
Of course.
Yes. Good night.
Good night.